So Lydia's showing her screen, and this is how we're going to proceed. Lydia's going to go through some of the earlier ones, just briefly hit on each one, give you a sense of what we did, and that may stimulate some questions and discussion, and then we can come back and someone, if you were in a session, you might say, well, I remember this and I thought this was really important. It was the one thing I remember from all my participation. Or maybe you weren't in a session at all and you're like, well, I really wish I could know what Brian Bagley kind of was getting at. So Lydia, go ahead and take it away, and we'll see where the audience wants to go after that.
So like Chris said, we had a lot of sessions, but I'm going to focus on some of the earlier ones. I'm going to go through about 6 of the earlier sessions and just talk about what we discussed and some of the key take-home points from those. So the first session that we had was February 12th. Chris led the first session, and it was really only some interested NRCS staff. I was in on those meetings, and so was Charlie Ivins from the Verona office, and also Jenny Templeton and Lucy Kostler from out in the eastern part of the state. And then as we went on, more and more people were added to the group. But at the beginning, it was a pretty small group of just NRCS staff. And so Chris introduced us to the Soil Health Assessment Work Group, talked about what his goals were. He introduced us to the 8 points he shared and some other points from the Virginia NRCS Soil Health Strategic Plan. And then we also went through a tool that the Verona field office had come up with to use for soil health assessment, just locally there in their area, because they thought it was something that the field office could use, and they found it to be useful. And so they showed us the tool that they had been using, and we had some discussion on that too. So the key takeaways from the first session, I went back and re-listened to it because that was a while ago, but the key things that stood out to me from those discussions were that the field office really feels that there are a lot of farmers that are investing in soil health, but it would be good for them to have something to help encourage them and keep them motivated to keep going. And so that's where the site-specific numbers come in, because they're important for comparison. So whether it's farmers saying, this is where I was, and now I can see this is how I've improved, this is where I am now, or if they're comparing to other farmers in the area. And so what the field office really hopes to see is a simple and appealing soil health checkup type report, just so that the field office can go out with farmers and complete that and leave them with something to be able to reference and look back at for future use. And so that was pretty much what was discussed during that first session. The second session was about the same group of NRCS staff. It was February 26th, and during this session, we went more in depth on the soil health assessment tool that the Verona NRCS office had developed, and I also, along with Alan Hawkins, presented some comments and some feedback from the Harrisonburg field office on their perspective on soil health and what was needed for the field office. And so Charlie Ivins and myself kind of talked during that one and presented. And I forgot to mention the previous video was not recorded, meeting was not recorded, but this one was. And so once we get all of the videos edited and posted somewhere, this is one of the videos that will be available to view. So some of the key takeaway points from the second session, when we were discussing, there is pretty much a front and back document that they were using to assess soil health in the field. And so one of the things that was resonating with everybody in that discussion was that the field office really wants the soil health assessment tool to be simple, to not be overly complicated, because like Chris had mentioned, we want the farmers, the clients, to be able to understand what they're reading and what they're getting with a soil health assessment. And one of the other clear takeaways was that the goal of doing soil health assessment and pursuing this on the field office level is to help promote understanding so that farmers can understand what's going on in their soils and in their on their farm, and how they can adjust and change their management to help find solutions. So pretty much giving farmers the tools they need to discover their own solutions when it comes to soil health. I guess I'll ask now and see if anybody has anything from these two sessions that they remember that maybe stood out. I think maybe one of the only people on here, not to call you out, Jenny, but I think you might be one of the only people in the meeting currently that was a part of this meeting. I wasn't sure if you had any thoughts or anything that you remember from this session or the previous session.
I think you did a great job of the recap and, basically what you had said about keeping it simple, but it was helpful to have that tool, but keeping it as simple as possible. And also, being able to give the producer something that is tangible, that said, look at what we did out here, and you can continue to build on it, is important too. So you did a great job with the recap, and that's basically what I remember from it.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
If I could jump in, and something that comes to mind, Lydia and Jenny, is that I don't think anyone at NRCS at any level would argue with the points that our field staff made about what's important to them. Everybody would say, amen, this is where we need to be. But the reality is that the soil health assessment tool, policy-related documents that our field staff are supposed to follow, the linkage between the results and the farmers understanding them, that's not part of those documents, if you see what I mean. And that's a gap that we're going to have to fill. That the gap between taking a national NRCS recommended soil health assessment, let's say a field assessment strategy, right? A cropland and field assessment, and helping convert the results into something farmers can understand. That is a shortcoming, a problem, and that's something we have to work on. Thanks.
Yeah, good points. So our third session was primarily Chris was giving an overview of the Cornell Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health, so the CASH system. And so he gave us an overview of that. He'd mentioned it before, and some of us from the field office were interested, and so he reviewed some of the example reports and kind of went through what their assessment incorporated. And so he went through that, and then the field staff gave their feedback about what they thought made sense from that system for Virginia NRCS. And so this was another meeting where it was primarily only NRCS staff. I think our group had gotten a little bit bigger. I believe maybe then like Cameron Clark, maybe Greg Hammer and Dave Harper might have joined by then. Potentially that might have been the next one when they joined. But this meeting was recorded, and so that should be available eventually. And there was also some general discussion about which aspects and which assessments of soil health to promote. And so the key takeaways from this meeting consisted of really focusing on meeting farmers where they are, and so not going way above their heads or way too in depth right from the beginning, because then you're going to lose a lot of people. And as far as the CASH system, some of the things that the field office really liked from that were the way that they presented their results with, colors and graphics, and using a lot of visual aids in that. Field office staff really liked that. I didn't mention that in here, but thought it was worth mentioning, something that they thought would be good to incorporate in what we developed for Virginia NRCS. We also discussed how some assessment can occur from the office. And so Dave Harper really focused on that, and he was talking about how we need to weave what we know about those inherent qualities of the soil into our assessment to be able to take what we already know and use that to, I guess, better focus our assessment of soil health. And then one other thing that Cornell did was they have really focused on working to be able to calibrate the results that they get. And so having a background of results and assessment results and numbers to be able to calibrate results that they get for their area. And so that really stood out as something that is key, is saying, okay, well, what are we going to do with these numbers, and how are we going to calibrate the results that we get? Does anybody have any feedback from that session at all? Or anything else that stood out?
You know, one thing I remember us highlighting was that the Cornell Soil Health Assessment strategy framework is really really elegant and has some great outputs. For example, like you said, you can get a report color-coded that shows you, are you doing kind of good, bad, or great compared to everyone else who put their soils through the lab. And that's, that's really useful. But at the same time, there's a huge amount of qualifiers, right? You have to understand that who you're being compared to, you know what I mean? And when you look at your overall soil health number, which is an average of, I think, 12 different values, right? If, you can have terrible soil aggregate stability, but if you've got everything else, in line, then that moves your score up in a way that might obscure the fact that you actually have some work to do on something. So I just thought I would highlight that. The take home here for those who are not as familiar with the Cornell system, and the take home from our meeting was not we should all jump on the Cornell soil health assessment strategy, but we can learn from it. And we talked about what its strengths were, but also its weaknesses, which includes spending $150 to send in one soil sample if you want to get the comprehensive results.
Yeah, I remember discussion about the price inhibitive. Yes. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I wanted to share the Cornell system. I thought, particularly in the field in Verona, we felt like it was interesting in that it weighted different practices and results. And while it's comparing you to an average, it was, Chris, I thought, very good at identifying what practices would have a higher priority in changing your soil health number. And so we felt like in Verona that the field office needed that aspect of any soil health assessment. You can't change everything tomorrow. That's unrealistic. So where do we start? Is a high soil loss because you're not close to T. So do you need to focus on no-till, soil loss, erosion issues, or is it something else? So that ranking we felt like was important.
Yeah, and Richard, we should have given you more credit because just to mention that, the Verona tool that you guys piloted, the idea was to learn from that. Was a project of yours, that Charlie Ivins, your boss there in your part-time NRCS role that you had for a number of years that he asked you to work on. And what's interesting, you just mentioned soil loss, right? Which many of us would say is an absolutely crucial first element in assessing how we're doing on soil health and soil health management. Is the soil washing away? That is not. in the Cornell assessment scheme, but it is in the assessment scheme that you came up with, for rating how are we doing. And so I have to congratulate you and thank you for that. But just highlighting, that point,
Yeah, and I will apologize, Richard, that you weren't mentioned in that. I knew that you had worked on that, but I neglected to include that in my description of what we were discussing. But that was a really good tool, and that was the focus of a lot of the beginning discussions that we had in this work group were based around that tool that you all had come up with.
Well, technically, you are still right, because I was doing that behind the scenes and funneling it through Charlie. So you're still correct.
All right, yeah. So that kind of sums up what we looked at for the cash system. Yeah. So the other two key things, like Chris had mentioned, were definitely the price, and then one other thing that came to mind while we were discussing it was that another thing that was kind of inhibitive was the fact that you had the huge manual, which is very interesting, and it's a very good resource. I have through it and have read through it and referenced it a lot. But in order to completely understand their assessment, it takes a lot of time digging into that and sort of reading some of the background. So session 4 took place in the end of March, and it was an overview of the Maryland Million Acre Challenge Soil Health Program. And so Amber Cather and Lisa Garfield were the ones speaking during that meeting. And this was one of the first meetings that we opened up, and we had some selected partners that were in on the call, along with the field staff. And this session was recorded. And just to try to clear up some confusion, and I think the next one I'm going to review is also going to be about the Maryland PASA soil health study. And so they're related, but we had 2 separate sessions. This one was more focused on just the Million Acre Challenge. And then the next session that we're going to review was also looking at the PASA study. And so Lisa gave us an overview, and so did Amber, of what the Million Acre Challenge is, some of the work that they've been doing. They shared some of their results, and they discussed some of the challenges that they've had, some of the lessons learned, and some of the really big key takeaways that they've had through that program. And so the key takeaways that I had from rewatching this and looking at my notes from when I watched it were that it's really important that within NRCS and with our partners, we have an alignment of those soil health definitions and on an understanding of the topics associated with soil health across the state. So through, the state agencies, the local partners, and within NRCS, just having alignment on those is key to understanding and to everybody being on the same page. They really emphasized the importance of working with partners and collaborating, because that allowed them to help fill in the gaps and to help amplify the efforts by each partner. And so that was really important to their program. And then another key takeaway from their presentation was that they really found value in asking farmers their advice and their input on how they want to learn and how they want to be able to receive information. And so I think they had a lot of success through seeking that out and trying to incorporate farmers' input into how they implemented the program. And so I'm going to go right ahead into the next one, and then just since it was on sort of the same topic. So this was actually jumping to session 7 a little bit later. So this took place in June. And this meeting was more focused on the PASA Soil Health Benchmark Study in Maryland. And so we heard from Lisa Garfield again. And by this point, we had quite a few partners included in our Shaw sessions, and there was a recording. And so she presented the results and some of their key lessons learned from the PASA study in Maryland. The key takeaways from that session, there was a lot discussed during that meeting and a lot of different topics, but I thought overall it was emphasized a few times that it's not about the numbers, it's about farmer understanding. And so she thought it was really important to be prepared to answer questions that farmers are going to have about the results. She said, you know, when they were handing farmers the numbers, handing them the information that they got, they had a whole lot of questions. And so she said it was really important for them to have people there on the ground with them to be able to explain to them the background and answer the questions about that. And then another key point of this program was that they had these groups where the farmers would get together once they had their results, and they would discuss them and talk about their management and their results and how they compare with each other. And that was a really important key way for farmers to be able to learn about their results. In addition to asking questions, discussing with each other was really important. And so did anybody else have anything that they felt was really stood out to them about the sessions related to the Million Acre Challenge or the PASA study in Maryland?
I'll just say it's a very, very elegant, well thought out, significant effort they're putting together up there. It's really an educational program, right? It's not about the soil health testing is a component of an educational effort, right? And so a big part of it is these peer groups, right, where they've divided their farmer audience into different categories. So they have grain farmers, they have pasture managers, and they have vegetable farmers, and the idea is that you're not just getting free soil health testing from Cornell and getting interesting information. You are expected to and encouraged to interact with your peers. And it's the soil health test results are not really what's important. It's almost like those are, what I recall, perhaps I'm wrong. You can tell me, Lydia, if this makes sense, but it seems like the soil health test results are a topic to get you into a deeper conversation with peers about what they're doing, what you're doing, and what you can do better.
Yeah, I would agree that in their overall goals and their plans, the assessment results were definitely a tool to help cultivate that conversation about soil health and give something for those peer groups to be able to talk about and discuss, as leading them into talking about their management practices and as a tool for education.
What's really interesting is that quote, it's not about the numbers, it's about the understanding. I mean, that is a quote that came from Cornell a long time ago. And, you know, the way Cornell tries to provide the understanding is they have a 150-page book, right? So instead of just getting a little pamphlet with your soil test results, you know, they're saying, this is complicated enough, these 12 different assessments, and understanding what they mean and their implications and how you should react. You probably need to read this book. I had heard of the Million Acre Challenge, and this session was an opportunity to find out what they were doing, and I just kept seeing many of our key guiding concepts that we outlined illustrated by this project, including the idea it's not about the numbers in the end, it's about the understanding.
Yeah, and I think that's what I found with rewatching a lot of these videos and revisiting my notes was that, like you mentioned before, a lot of the 8 principles were either explicitly or implicitly supported by our discussions and by our presenters and what they were sharing with us. So the last session that I will be doing a review for was session 8, which was at the end of June. And this was looking at the PASA Soil Health Benchmark Study from a Pennsylvania perspective. And so we had Franklin Egan with PASA that spoke to us that day. And there were NRCS personnel, and by then we had a pretty core group of partners that were joining us for our sessions. So he kind of did a similar to what Lisa did the week before. So he went through the PASA study there, and he actually presented a lot of their results. So he had a lot of graphs and data that he presented from the different assessments that they did. He had some overall data from all of the assessments that they had done through this program, which that was really interesting to see kind of what they expected to see, and then he presented what they actually saw and what they learned from it. So I had two main takeaways from listening back to the session, and the first one was that they took the results from some of their Soil Health Champions farms and they put it into a little like one-page fact sheet, and they highlighted some of the key assessments that stood out or that they looked at on their Soil Health Champions farms. And so it's pretty much like a tool for the farmer to be able, kind of like bragging rights, to be like, look, you know, look at how well we're doing, look at what we're doing, and to open the door for conversation for other farmers to be able to ask them about what they're doing and have discussion, and also just as an outreach tool for the program. And then there was a lot of discussion during this session and a little bit in the session before about education on nutrient management and how it was really important to provide that along with this soil health outreach and education. That it was really important because I think in their study and in their program, they had a lot of smaller, organic vegetable farms, or just organic vegetable farms, smaller organic farms in general, were a part of this. And a lot of them were having issues with legacy phosphorus, and just when it came to fertility and nutrient management and how they were providing nutrients, they were running into some issues that they had to address along with the soil health aspects. And so they thought it was really important to be prepared to provide some education on nutrient management along with their soil health outreach. So that is all I had from that session. And so if there's any feedback from that discussion and that meeting, we can talk about that now. And I believe that is all that I had as far as reviewing the SHAW sessions in the past. So I can hand it back over to Chris and open it up for any discussion on not just the ones that I reviewed, but if there's any feedback or comments from any of the other sessions. I don't know if, Chris, you want to go back to sharing your screen and your slides.
Chris, can I share while you're transitioning?
Yeah, please.
Actually, what struck me from the PASA presentation is how focused they are on helping farmers really document what they're doing from season to season, crop to crop, season to season, and even year to year. And I just want to throw out there that basically that's what Virginia's nutrient management program is designed to do. Mr. Farmer, remember that this poultry litter is weighted heavier on the phosphorus than what this one crop may need. So you need to allow for that in future seasons or future years. And what I find is the farmers that are successful start paying a lot of attention to what they've done earlier in the year or even last year. And so it just rang home with me that what they're doing needs to be continued and reinforced, because I think about asking a farmer, did you put poultry litter on last year? Oh, sure. Well, what about the year before, and what was your crop yield? So gathering this information, getting it more detailed, and having it retrospective is, to me, one of the more important things to promoting any of these BMPs.
I'll just say that a huge aspect of what they're doing. And I think a lot of Franklin's time, a lot of Lisa's time in Maryland, right? Franklin's in Pennsylvania, Lisa's in Maryland. A huge part of their time is spent getting management information from farmers. Like, what tillage tool did you use? I don't know. I want to know when you tilled, but I also want to know which tool you used, and what cover crop did you put out there, and how many days was the cover crop in the field? So that's exhaustive, like, collection of all this information, which is, beyond what we would collect for a nutrient management plan. But I like what you're saying. I mean, it's about building awareness that these activities all have a soil health impact, one way or another, or we suspect they might. If this were to continue over a long period of time, you could see how powerful it would be, because they'll have this super detailed management information, and they'll also have the soil test results. The problem is, of course, that some of these soil health assessments do not change quickly. That it takes a long time to shift some of these numbers. On the nutrient management thing, what Lydia was getting, I want you to picture this. We had this discussion with some folks in Maryland, or I think the one I'm thinking was in Maryland, but it could be Pennsylvania potentially. But the Maryland one is very specific, where you have an organic vegetable farmer who's managing a relatively small plot of ground, right? So it's direct market vegetables, let's say. And that, one or two of their fields, let's say, have very, very high phosphorus levels. So you think, oh, well, nutrient management regulations suggest we should not apply phosphorus. Okay, this is an organic farm. How do you get nutrients to feed the crop if you need supplemental nutrients, if you can't apply any phosphorus? Because everything has to be an organic source. So there's always going to be some phosphorus in there, if it's derived from manure or anything else. So we get into this question of, in the name of not applying any more phosphorus on this relatively low risk environmental site, are we going to sacrifice yield of high value crops? And it just goes around and around. Complex questions that go beyond nutrient management. It's nutrient management, it's soil health management, it's production and economics, all woven together. It's integrated agronomy, and it's the farmer's real world.
Yeah, I wanted to continue on this topic of nutrient management and organic systems. Well, another thing we have to consider, the nutrient management has a very direct and central impact on soil health, because even on that 1 or 2 acres, when you have that phosphorus in the very high range, the mycorrhizae just pack up. They don't associate with the crop roots anymore, and you lose multiple benefits: uptake of micronutrients, improved drought resilience, improved soil carbon sequestration, and soil structure. So all these benefits are lost in that system. And conversely, when you've reached a high level of soil health, what sometimes is called a mature, organically managed field, the inputs you need to sustain crop yields become very much smaller, even smaller than good 4Rs nutrient management recommended. And very often you get to a point where all you need is a little bit of nitrogen to replenish what is harvested off. And very often a lot of that can be fixed through legumes in the rotation, and even to a lesser extent through non-leguminous nitrogen fixation. A lot of like cereal grains, corn, millet, things like that can have nitrogen fixing bacteria hosted in their root zone. It won't do as much as a legume, but it will contribute. And I think this is an exciting area of research. There's very substantial qualitative shifts in the microbiome in an organic system that is run fairly lean in terms of inputs, and the organic inputs used have a moderately high carbon to nitrogen ratio, like a finished vegetable compost, around 20-1, as opposed to poultry litter, which is very rich in phosphorus and is only like 6 or 7-1 C to N. In a poultry litter fed system, you don't have the level of microbial diversity and high functioning that you do in the system that is run mostly on crop diversification, crop rotation, cover crops, and moderate amounts of organic inputs that are calibrated so that the phosphorus levels remain optimum. And one of the things it's kind of a trap is that you look at vegetables and say, oh, they're heavy feeders, they need lots of everything. Well, you're only harvesting 10 pounds of phosphorus or 23 pounds of phosphate per acre in a good vegetable harvest. Whereas you get a grain harvest, you might go off of 20 pounds of elemental phosphorus or 30 pounds. So a lot of things to consider. And what's exciting is there's some studies out in California where they identified some of these mature organic fields where they've the nitrogen cycling was so tightly coupled that the bulk soil would test 5 parts per million nitrate. And everybody tells you, you try to grow tomatoes in 5 parts per million soil nitrate, you're going to get a deficient, low yielding crop. But these crops were fine. They had full yield. They had very active microbiome right in the root zone, interacting with plant enzymes to very efficiently transmute organic nitrogen from cover crop residues and the high C/N compost and the soil organic matter into nitrate, and it goes right in the crop root before you can even detect it in your soil test. So lots of exciting cutting edge research, and I think it can begin to be more practically applied. I know that Buzz Clute down in South Carolina did a webinar for NRCS showing that organically managed systems or very cutting edge conservation agriculture systems can sustain top yields on half the recommended nitrogen and no phosphorus or potassium. So anyway, I kind of went a long time, but I think this nutrient management area is a central issue in soil health.
Mark, thank you for bringing that up. And there's something you said, though, that I think is worthy of emphasis because, you know, I gave one case study or example, right? But I didn't probably fully explain it. And then you mentioned how exciting it is that some organic farming systems will achieve, you know, certain characteristics. But there's 3 words you said in a row at one point that I think are really important. You said crop diversity, rotation, and cover crops. And you know that, you know, I think it's really important that we continually qualify what we're talking about, because some organic systems, right, the term organic, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have lots of diversity and longer rotations and adequate legumes to provide, you know, that N. And you know, because there may be an organic vegetable farm that, you know, they rely heavily on a lot of brassicas, and they don't have the rotation, you know, they don't have that foundation there to and so, you know, they have a long way to go, and in that transitional period they have to say, well, am I going to feed this crop so I can pay my bills and, you know, maybe hurt the mycorrhizal, you know, symbiosis because I'm providing more phosphorus than is needed. So there's all these trade-offs and questions, but I think it's this transition to better systems and more crop diversity is both tough and exciting. Another thing that resonated in what you just said, I just can't help but say this. There's an old friend of mine that I met through my travels within NRCS from North Dakota, and the way he would say it is, I want all my fertilizer, all my nitrogen to be tied up in microbes. In other words, these microbes are little bags of fertilizer, and they may not show up as nitrate, you know, when you do a soil test, but they're a form of, you know, relatively available nitrogen that's out there, and that will become unlocked when the temperature and the moisture conditions are right for plants to grow. So it's just a much more sophisticated way, like you're saying, of thinking about nitrogen and assessing its availability.
I just want to quickly point out that the National Organic Standards require a crop rotation that not only prevents erosion, but helps with nutrient management and pest management. And they specifically say a diverse crop rotation that includes cover crops, sod crops, etc., catch crops. And so, you know, I know it would probably get to be a very sensitive issue with some of these farmers are trying to make a living growing broccoli on 2 acres. And yet, that is actually, I mean, the organic standards are much more than no, don't use any 10-10-10 or glyphosate or synthetic pesticides. It's way beyond that. So, and I look at the organic standards and I look at the four principles of soil health that NRCS has been working with for a dozen years. And I go, boy, about 90% overlap here.
When it comes to soil health, there is a large community that erroneously believe that organic agriculture is primarily about not using prohibited substances. And there's, in fact, should be tremendous overlap between soil health management that conventional and organic growers use. And we think there's a real opportunity to bring those audiences together. But
yeah,
we have to define our terms well.
Yeah, I would point out very briefly that not using a lot of those synthetics, that has quite a measure of protective value for the soil life. So it's kind of like I look at conservation agriculture and organic, and I say, okay, choose your unavoidable disturbance. A little bit of chemicals so you can go totally no-till, or a little bit of tillage so you can avoid all the synthetics. And I think there more research needs to be done on the chemical disturbance aspect and how that can be minimized. And I would include heavy use of poultry litter as a chemical disturbance to soil health. I know we're off of assessment, but as management is part of assessment, so I think there's a lot of overlap here.
Lydia, I think you did a great job. And I want to, again, give folks the context. I told Lydia, take a 2 to 3 hour video and boil it down into 2 bullets, each video. So she listened to about 10 hours of videos, and she boiled it down to about 8 bullets. And that's a lot harder to do than to give you a long transcript of everything that was said. Does anybody want to ask or talk more about any of these? We're going to head towards our wrap up.